What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 217. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today I'm joined by Patrick MacFarlane of the Liberty Weekly podcast and my colleague at the Libertarian Institute. Pat, how you doing today, buddy? Welcome back to the show.
Doing good, Kyle. Thanks for having me on again.
Happy to have you on, and I think we actually scheduled the show before we planned to talk about the COVID mandate, which excellent person to break this down from a legal perspective and not just, what libertarians think, which is interesting, but, we'll give a little bit more depth and a little bit more into the news end of it, why they made the ruling they did and everything like that. Also, some stories about cops like we always have when Pat's on the show. So, Pat, thanks so much for coming back, and let's just send people over to the Libertarian Institute, where you could find just in the right hand column margin, you have the news roundup that I write in the morning. Then skip down a couple, you could bypass like the Scott Horton show, who's that guy anyway. You get Conflicts of Interest and also Liberty Weekly. So a lot of great stuff on the homepage at the Libertarian Institute. Also great featured articles there. Sheldon Richmond's always writing for us, and the co-host of this show, Connor Freeman, is frequently there. So anyways, check out the Institute, support the show either by subscribing, YouTube, Odysee, Rumble for video version of the show, and then you can also check out the show on anywhere you can listen to audio podcasts, Facebook, Twitter. The Twitter handle is @con_interest, and then donate Patreon, Subscribestar, or crypto, and all that information is in the show notes page. Last one, I mentioned the sponsor of the show, Paloma Verde, PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Fantastic lineup of products at Paloma Verde. I typically stick with the topicals because I got some back pain, and that works really well for me. But also want to recommend the soft gels, which are great for when you got a little bit more of full body inflammation, or you're had a workout or something like that. Absolutely excellent. So whatever you got going on, there's probably something that could help you at Paloma Verde. PalomaVerdeCBD.com, promo code PEACE. Get yourself some great products. It's at a great price with the discount, and it gets the show a kit back, so you can help out the show as well. All right, Pat, let's get into it, and we're going to start the show today by talking about the COVID mandate and the Supreme Court ruling. Now, there are two rulings, to my understanding, correct? It wasn't just on the federal worker mandate. It was also on the healthcare worker mandate. And so I guess you'll explain both and everything. But Pat, go ahead, set us up what's happening here.
Yeah, so this ruling just recently came forward, and it was the OSHA case. So an important thing to understand about this ruling just off the bat is that this is a preliminary injunction that is going to block the enforcement of the mandate while other litigation continues. So this is not a final ruling on the issue. When you file in court, sometimes, we all know that it's a government court system, so it's not very fast. And so a lot of times when you have an issue where there's grave irreparable harm that will happen if this policy is allowed to go into place, there will be what's called a preliminary injunction. And so there's been a fast appeal to the Supreme Court to determine this preliminary issue. And so litigants in this case are looking to block the enforcement of the OSHA mandate and of the Medicare, Medicaid healthcare provider mandate.
Just to clarify real quick, Pat, was that the only issue in front of the court? Could the court have actually ruled on the whole OSHA mandate itself? Which, by the way, to clarify, it's you have to have the vaccine or wear a mask and test weekly is the actual mandate that they have here. So could the court have ruled against the whole thing, or was the only issue in front of it to rule on the injunction or not?
So as far as I understand, the only issue in front of the court was to rule on this preliminary injunction. Okay. However, it does give us a view into what might happen in the lower courts, because part of the test is to see whether the claim is likely to achieve on the merits, to prevail on the merits. So this is the Supreme Court saying that the OSHA case is likely to prevail on the merits. That meaning that the mandate is likely to be defeated. and that's kind of what the standard is. The
And
other part of the
so,
standard
it,
is go ahead, sorry.
oh, sorry. Just to cut and just to understand. So, I guess it may be the ideal world, Pat, right? Like, actually, what matters is what, arguments get brought in front of the court and everything like that by the attorneys. And so maybe this shouldn't be that big of a signal for what the Supreme Court will rule on. But is it pretty solid that the Supreme Court grants an injunction? They're very likely to rule that same way if the case comes in front of them.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. At this point in time, I don't think it's clear that the case will be appealed back to the Supreme Court, because effectively what the Supreme Court did is that they took this case, which was a fast-tracked appeal from the Sixth Circuit on this preliminary injunction issue. They took it and they ruled on it and they sent it back to the Sixth Circuit to continue.
Okay. All right. Well, and then do you know if the other ruling, the one on the healthcare workers mandate, was also just on an injunction, or if that was actually on the mandate itself?
My understanding is that it was an injunction.
Okay. All right, great. All right, so get back to where you were before I interrupted you a couple questions ago.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, so just to differentiate so everyone understands, I think there's been a lot of coverage, but just to make sure, yes, the OSHA case would apply to any private employer employing 100 or more employees, and it would mandate vaccination, or I think that it allows for religious or medical exemptions, but it also will force these employees to, the testing requirements or the exemption.
Right.
And different mask requirements and things like that. Then on the other hand, there is a vaccination requirement for any healthcare facility that accepts Medicare and Medicaid patients. In that case, it's called Biden v. Missouri, and the OSHA case is called National Federation of Independent Business v. Department of Labor. And just to dive into kind of some of the reasoning behind the ruling here, in the OSHA case, the court really kind of took a look at what the authority that OSHA has to do these things, because if an administrative agency is going to be given authority to do things, they have to be given authority through the legislative branch, which in theory represents the people. And so I say that in theory. But what ultimately the court's decision kind of turned on, and Gorsuch wrote a concurring opinion. So it wasn't carried. Gorsuch's concurring opinion wasn't carried by the majority of the court, but he wrote just to kind of clarify that OSHA has no authority to dictate matters of public health. And so the Supreme Court really made a distinction based off of what the purpose of OSHA is and what their authority is. OSHA is supposed to protect health, or excuse me, they're supposed to protect working conditions. And they really said that a vaccine mandate is a public health issue, and it's not a employer-employee issue, because COVID-19 exists everywhere. It's not unique to the workplace. And a vaccine is like a very invasive procedure, they wrote there. And it also, it provides, in theory, provides protection, not just in the workplace, but also out and about.
Okay. And just to, I guess, out of curiosity, is there an argument here, I guess, on executive power that is being made at all? So, because it seems to me like I remember the old test that I used to talk about when I was in high school and debate and everything was, the executive has the most ability to carry out executive authorities and stuff when it's in line with what Congress wants to do. And it's pretty clear that this isn't in line with what Congress wants to do. So are they trying to make the challenge on hey, you can't just mandate this? Congress would have to pass a law if this is going to be the regulation that everybody has to abide by.
Yeah, and that's a great issue to key in on. It was Gorsuch specifically mentioned in his concurring opinion. He was joined by Clarence Thomas and Justice Alito, saying that it's clear that Congress rejected this because there was a vote in the Senate rejecting this. And OSHA, my understanding is that whether or not the president directs OSHA to do something, it's more a matter of whether or not OSHA has the ability to do that. And I believe that, is it your understanding, Kyle, that administrative agencies are part of the executive branch?
I would assume that OSHA would be under the authority of the executive branch, right? I don't know under what agency, but I would assume that would be a subsection of an agency, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. Well, another thing that came in was this talk of how destructive that it would be to private companies. And that's part of the requirements for an injunction, is that to prove irreparable harm, if the OSHA mandate goes into place, the steep fines and the potential loss of employees is a harm that could not be remedied. It's something that's irreparable. And so what happens if you allow this mandate to go into place, and then later on it ends up that it doesn't hold weight on the merits in the final judgment, and you have all these people who have left their positions, all these companies that are destroyed, even though it was done over nothing. And so that's kind of the point of this whole injunction.
And I just checked real quick. OSHA is a part of the Department of Labor, so
Okay, right.
that's a cabinet level position. So I would assume that's all acting at the direction of the president. It should be assumed. So I guess here too that this would be a question of, Pat, like if there was a law on the books that would require specifically like any new regulation that impacts like $1 billion of business or something like that, to have to go through Congress rather than just being able to be levied by executive fiat, would be something that would stand in the way of this. Unfortunate that doesn't exist, but that would be a way to rein in these federal agencies a little bit, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think it'd be a different issue if Congress were to pass something like this. The standard would be different, and instead of trying to determine whether or not OSHA has the authority to do this, they would be doing more of a challenge based off of like a constitutional claim, with the varying levels of review that you talk about in constitutional law and law school, whether that's rational basis review, rational basis with a bite, intermediate scrutiny, or strict scrutiny. And I would think it'd be strict scrutiny, which would require a narrowly tailored policy to really prevent disease. And it'd be interesting to get exactly what the evidence is on that, because famously the court, I think it was Justice Sotomayor, who's really known for being kind of a liberal nut job. She had this completely. She said that there's 100,000 children who are currently on ventilators in the United States with COVID, and that's just patently false. So
Right.
It's terrifying.
And just to clarify, I believe she said who are like seriously ill with COVID or something like that. Because people get so picky over it. Not that that's really different from what you said, but I
Yeah,
think she said seriously ill. And I think according even to like the CDC, the number is what, like 3,000 or so. And even then, I'm sure there's some questions around that number. But can you imagine, Pat, if say Rand Paul was citing some numbers on the number of people who died after receiving the vaccine or something like that, and inflated the number by like 3,000% or something like Sotomayor did? I'm pretty sure he would be banned from every platform, and everybody would be running ads about how he's killing Americans and everything like that. And there's absolutely no real. I mean, like the right is going after her, and honestly, a lot of it gets to be a little hacky and. They're just looking for the easy dunk and all that, but it does deserve real criticism, and it's a really, really wrong statement. So on that, in the actual like rulings and everything that you read, is there anything about the effectiveness of the vaccine that either came out in this case or that was relevant to deciding the case?
Yeah, I think in what I read of the majority opinion in the OSHA case, It seems like it's just kind of taken for granted, in my opinion. It seemed like it was taken for granted that the vaccine prevents admission and it like prevents hospitalizations. And I mean, frankly, I don't know if the evidence was borne out in briefing or, the evidence to support that assertion was borne out in briefing or oral arguments. But I think it was even Gorsuch, if I'm not mistaken, in his concurring opinion that said that, yeah, well, the vaccine helps reduce admission. But it's really funny because, the definition of vaccine has changed in the last couple of years. And so you would think that, a vaccine would provide immunity. But that's just my editorialization.
Right. And I guess, too, I wonder if, this is something that really gets, I think, conflated where people will say, oh, the vaccine prevents transmission or prevents hospitalization, where I think even the official claim is that it reduces your chances of being hospitalized and everything. And I mean, if you look at the official data that's put out, they certainly paint a case that you can reduce your chances of hospitalization if you get COVID if you take the vaccine, but that is based on the data that we're getting, and it's certainly not a prevention thing, which is I think is important, where this really gets conflated, and then people who are just watching CNN, they hear, oh, if you get vaccinated, then it's going to prevent you from being hospitalized. That could cause people to take undue risk that they wouldn't otherwise take if they were given the correct information. And so I don't know. That's just a problem I've noticed in like the media and particularly the mainstream narrative lately. Not just trying to rip up on vaccines, but to actually talk about like the effect that that rhetoric has on people. Pat, anything on the other case, the federal money vaccine
Yeah,
mandate? Yeah,
the
the
health
healthcare workers.
Yeah, one final note though, to your point, the Biden administration in the OSHA case argued that the mandate would, quote, save over 6,500 lives and prevent hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations. Okay, well, I mean, if you're talking about kind of an unprecedented mandate on employees to take an invasive medical procedure, and your argument is that it's going to save 6,500 lives. I mean, it's just absurd to me. The like it in
Wait,
order
6500, like
yeah,
six, oh wow. So
6,500.
and I mean, like, if we're talking about those numbers, and how many people are they actually thinking that it's going to move the margin on getting vaccinated anyways?
It's
Not very
so
big.
the government expected the mandate would cover 84 million workers.
Well, how
Now,
many people are going to get vaccinated because of that? That's more my question.
right. Yeah, I don't know.
Or because if like 80% of them are already vaccinated, and then only 10% of the remaining get vaccinated, and the other 10% all quit, then that's not, I don't know, very effective. I would guess, but I don't know by what standard we're on here. But the healthcare worker mandate.
Yeah, so Biden v. Missouri, the justices agreed to allow the Biden administration to enforce nationwide a rule that requires nearly all healthcare workers at facilities that participate in the Medicare and Medicaid programs to be fully vaccinated against COVID-19 unless they qualify for a medical or religious exemption. So the Department of Health and Human Services issued the rule, which applies to more than 10 million workers. So that rule was issued in November, but there were two federal district courts in Missouri and Louisiana that put the rule on hold in roughly half the states. So they're talking about a preliminary injunction that occurred at a lower court level.
And I think I covered this one on the show. There were two different cases. One was through the Louisiana court, I believe.
Yep.
14 states there were exempt from it. And then there's the 10 that were through the Missouri. I think it was a St. Louis court that rejected it. And so there's kind of like two cases, and I guess they're a little bit different, which is where like my legal knowledge makes it hard for me to continue covering this, because it's not as simple as, just, one size fits all for the whole country. You got cases here and there and everywhere else.
Yeah, and that's, I mean, frankly, the procedure for this can get really complicated, especially if you're not someone who is used to, I mean, even as an attorney like myself, if you're not someone who's used to keeping your eye on federal litigation, it gets a bit confusing, and it takes some study. But the court, its reasoning, it emphasized that the Department of Health and Human Services has ensured has required vaccination in the past. So they said HHS has long required Medicare and Medicaid providers to comply with a variety of conditions if they want to receive Medicare and Medicaid funding. And they said again, the court reasoned that because COVID-19 is, quote, a highly contagious, dangerous, and especially for Medicare and Medicaid patients, deadly disease. So you're getting kind of that mainstream kind of narrative on what COVID is, which at least in a sense, it reflects reality because it is those populations, the older population, who's actually at risk for this.
Yeah. And so this would apply to like not just a hospital, which is I think what people are, thinking of here, but also like rehab facilities and long-term care nursing home type facilities, which that's where like I don't know, maybe I'm a little bit more concerned, like, not that working in a nursing home is like a bad career or anything like that, but it's maybe not the greatest job to deal with people who have like dementia and Alzheimer's and who could be aggressive or belligerent and who don't have, control of all their functions all the time. And, it's just, it could be a tough job. And so you're maybe giving them an incentive to just leave the career. It seems like, at certain levels, psychiatric hospitals as well, these are places like Rhode Island is deploying the National Guard to the psychiatric hospital, which seems just a little bit concerning to me. But they're having to deploy National Guard to these long-term care facilities, and you just have to wonder if you're taking young men who thought maybe they would be fighting a war, maybe they would be filling sandbags or something like that. They probably never thought they would be changing adult diapers. And so when you put people in that condition, it does lead to cases of like, neglect or even abuse. I imagine there's a real risk of that increasing, having these people doing it and not people who are necessarily, being paid to be that kind of, worker.
Yeah, I think it's really long-sighted of you to even think of those issues that might come up. I don't know if the court has, and I don't know.
Just that you mentioned that real quick, I want to say this because this is something that I had talked about like last May when I was really concerned about the lockdowns. And that is just, understanding like the third and fourth order, like effects of poverty around the world. There's this new study. I'm trying to find the article here real quick. It's from Yahoo, and the study goes into and explains that there's a huge spike in underage pregnancy or childhood pregnancy in Zimbabwe as a result of this. The schools were closed down, so you have 13-year-old girls who go and get themselves impregnated by older men, hoping that that's essentially their ticket in life to have some sort of life, because you'll have a life with somebody who's wealthy. Essentially, the family like tries to leverage, like, hey, you had sex with my underage daughter, so either marry her or we're going to press charges and everything like that. And so putting just a miserable situation in place, right? And you of course there's plenty of room to say, well, it really doesn't make sense to get pregnant. This is a 13-year-old girl who no longer has access to school because of the COVID lockdowns. There's no online learning in Zimbabwe for a lot of these kids, right? And so when the schools close, the education closes, and so they see that pathway in life close, and the only other option to avoid probably having essentially no options and no quality of life in Zimbabwe for these young girls, or at least again, imagine from the perspective of 13-year-old you, not 30 or whatever year old you is listening to this right now. It doesn't surprise me at all they're making these kind of decisions. And so something that nobody is, really cares about when they're advocating for lockdowns and things like that. But there are long-term effects of this poverty, and the global poverty rate is going up for the first time in 20 years. And so it's not something that's going to go away tomorrow. You can't just, even if you lift the lockdowns, the additional people in poverty are going to take years to claw out of it, as probably it's going to take years or so for the supply chain to come back to the, same quality it was, and the same, even again, if the lockdowns are lifted tomorrow, I'm saying this. So just want to mention that. Pat, anything else on these cases? If not, I got two more like kind of libertarian-esque questions on them.
Yeah, well, just to touch on your last point, if you really want to get down to base principles, that this is the essential lesson of Henry Hazlitt's Economics in One Lesson. This is the praxeological analysis that the Misesian has. Basically, when you're talking about a given economic proposal, to basically take into mind all of the effects of a given policy, the seen and the unseen. That's Bastiat. But I think this is a good example for Misesians and Rothbardian libertarians to come in and really try to provide that analysis that isn't really happening. But
Yeah.
What's your other libertarian question?
Yeah, just that it should have been obvious for anybody who's a libertarian from very early on when they start these lockdowns that they were essentially trading elderly lives in the United States for the lives of young children living in severely impoverished countries like Africa, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East and stuff like that. So anyways, the libertarian, I guess, based questions are, and I guess answer this in two ways. Are people making the arguments, and do you think the arguments could be made? And I guess the first one would be kind of on maybe a First Amendment or HIPAA ground somewhere in there, like the right to individual like choice, or obviously that's not in the Bill of Rights, but I don't know, maybe they could somehow tie this into like a First Amendment, of course, freedom of religion type argument, but maybe something else in there where there's people who aren't religious, but that I guess doesn't necessarily mean like you can't like claim that like I'm spiritually Kyle, and anything that enters my body that's not of my choice is a violation of my spirituality. And like, are we really going to say that's more illegitimate than Christianity in 2022? Like, that seems like kind of an argument that you're not allowed to make anymore. So like, I'm wondering on that level, can you make an argument? And then also 10th Amendment, should this maybe be an issue reserved to the states?
Yeah, and I guess the most meaningful commentary I can provide on that within my wheelhouse is just talking about the nature of the Supreme Court in general. And I think you have have we talked about John Hasness's The Myth of the Rule of Law? I mean,
I think so.
Yeah, it's just basically that there is no right answer when it comes to the law. There's no objective truth. He gives the example in this essay, John Hasness does, of when you're in law school and the law professor asks you, he gives you a given fact pattern, and he asks you what's the right answer given the Supreme Court's jurisprudence. And two different law students can give totally different answers for the opposing sides even. These answers conflict, and they're both right because there is no right answer. And so I guess really that just leading in to say that, in my opinion, the Supreme Court is just playing makesy-upsies, for lack of a better term. There's no objective answer of whether a thing is constitutional or is not constitutional. It's politics. They're not above it. It's just, if you're smart enough, you can create an answer that justifies any intrusion and any violation of the Constitution. That being said, though, when you play the court's game, you have to play the court's game. So when you go in, your arguments have to be focused on the issue that's at hand. And the reason why we're not seeing it here in this case is because this is confined to a preliminary injunction. And I guess the arguments more so, the lawyers lead with the arguments that are most likely to win, in their opinion. And an argument saying that OSHA doesn't have the authority is the one that's most likely to win. So you're not going to lead with an argument based in the Bill of Rights if those arguments aren't as good as the OSHA arguments. That being said, Other cases certainly are leading with the arguments based on the on a Bill of Rights claim, like First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, Fifth Amendment kind of stuff. But even within that sphere, you are confined by the precedent set by the court that they just made up.
Yeah.
And so you got to go within, that corner of it. So, we might read and say, hey, it says here in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 1, First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press and of the people peaceably to assemble. That might make total perfect sense to us. But guess what? In the past, the Supreme Court has 70 or 80 cases that defined what that means. And so even though it says plain words on the sheet of paper, you can't just lead with, okay, this clearly is in violation of the First Amendment. I mean, people, if you're closing bars and churches, or if you're not allowing people the freedom of association to go to a bar or to do whatever without getting a vaccine, that clearly violates the First Amendment. Well, they have all this precedent that they can make up whatever they want.
Yep. All right, Pat. Let's move on and talk about the cops here. There is this case, this Virginia Beach case that was just so egregious to me. This from the AP. Official: police use fake DNA reports during interrogations. And so what happened here, Pat, is you got two stinky, smelly cops in a room with you for 10 hours. And after 10 hours, they come in after accusing you of committing the murder, and they slam down a piece of paper in front of you and they say, you deny it, you deny it, you deny it. But here we have DNA certified 100% proof that it was your, whatever inside the victim or on the victim or whatever the hell, and we know for certainty that you did it, so sign this confession or we're going to make sure you die in the electric chair. And then people sign a confession, and the cops are confused as how they wrongfully convict people of crimes. So how is this legal, I guess, is my question.
I don't know. It really boggles my mind, because it seems like cops can lie to you with impunity. But if you lie to the police or you obfuscate the truth, well, that's obstruction or something worse. And we're going to throw the book at you. But we can lie to you, or we can fib, or we can withhold information or manipulate you. That's fine. But, in this instance, the lie was incredibly complex. There was a bogus piece of paper proving a fabricated DNA test, included a seal and letterhead from the state agency. The AG's office said in 2 instances, the documents included the signature of a fictitious employee from the department. And in at least 1 instance, a forged report was presented to a court as evidence, the AG's office said. This is egregious. Could you imagine what kind of conceit would it take for someone to create a fictitious employee of the state testing agency and to fabricate letterhead,
right,
just to lie to someone?
Right. And of course, this isn't happening to somebody who has a lawyer, right? So this isn't happening to somebody who's wealthy and who could fight back against it. Also, the person who definitely falls for this, or who ends up confessing after something like this is something they didn't do, is maybe somebody that would be like an alcoholic, a drug user, something like that. They've blacked out before. And so then they're thinking in their head, well, I would never do something like that. I would never do something like that. But maybe I blacked out once and did something absolutely crazy and I don't remember it, but I don't know where I was at that time. And they're saying they got my DNA, so I might as well just confess. Or, imagine like your dumbest friend, and not like, the guy who's like happy-go-lucky and not super sharp, but like, like the really kind of slow kid that may really be confused and be like, well, if they got me, they got me. Like and just admit to a crime because, as far as they know, CSI is true. And when the cops bring you the documents that says we got your DNA, that means you did it. And I can't imagine how terrible of a person you have to be to dupe somebody with this.
I think certain investigators, or you'd be surprised the amount of power that will go to someone's head, even if it's very small. And I don't know if I've mentioned on the show, but I just recently started my own law practice, and as a part of it, I'm taking public defender cases, and I have audio of interrogations that happen in a burglary case, right? And the tactics that the investigators use and the lakes that they go through to intimidate um, a suspect, saying, "Oh, you know, when we talked last, you lied to me. You lied to me because I went and I talked to these people, and they're saying this about you. And I'm gonna have this piece of paper, and I'm gonna go down to the DA's office. And if you don't cooperate with me right now, I'm gonna have you charged with this and this and this." And frankly, it's disgusting that a mature adult would want to talk like that to another human being.
Yeah.
But these are the kind of tactics that they use. I mean, this happens every single day, and people are not educated enough in school to know what their rights are, and they're promised things, and these are lies that investigators will say, is that, oh, it's really going to help you out if you just help us out, and if you tell us what happened, you're going to feel good about it, but it will also help you in your case. So they say things like that. Just
Yep.
watch the first 48.
Yeah. And just a couple, I guess, more things on that. I've read cases they went as far as telling people fictitiously that their own mother thought they did it. And so, I mean, I can't imagine, kids who are really dependent and have like a codependent relationship on their mother to hear, we're talking about kids a lot of times they'll do this it's not people who are over 30, it's people who are more involved in violent crimes, and that's typically like 16 to 26, 27, 28, like that age range where like a lot of the young men are like engaged in this kind of crime. So that's who they're picking up here. This isn't people again who are like 40-year-old business professionals or anything who have lawyers and who could piece out what's going on here and the lies or everything like that. So never believe what the cops tell you if they're accusing you of something. It could be a complete absolute fabrication with no sense of truth at all whatsoever.
What you really need to do is to just unequivocally invoke your right to speak to an attorney and insist on speaking to an attorney. There is never any well, it might have happened once or twice, but 99 times out of 100, talking to the police is not going to get you anywhere. It can only hurt you. And just before we move on, one comment is that, think about the last time that you talked to a salesperson, or the last time that you tried to buy a car or something like that. Some people are good at playing hardball, but think about how hard it is for the average person to even like get a word in edgewise or to avoid being manipulated by a good car salesman. Now think about being a 14-year-old kid or an 17-year-old kid being with experienced professionals where you're in a situation where your life could be ruined forever, and how scared and terrified you are. It's a whole nother level.
I mean, one time I went to a car dealership and the guy was such a good salesman, I left because I felt like he was going to sell me something I didn't need. But had, and too, I'm sure like what a lot of times happens in police departments is like this detective gets known as the guy who crats the criminals. And so, then that's his reputation. That's who he is. So he goes in there not looking to get the truth, looking to get the confession, because that's what he does.
Right.
You know what I mean? And so I'm sure that's a part of it. Now, what kind of recourse would you have? Is there any? I'm sure qualified immunity covers the prosecution and the police for going along and lying about this, but maybe it's from the taxpayers, but maybe if this happens to you, you could get some money from the state. I mean, if you really thought you committed a murder that you didn't commit, that would have to be a lot of mental anguish to go through. Also, just screwing with a person's psychology to a level that the police are going to present a false document of DNA testing from the AG to you. I mean, what level of the matrix do you feel like you're living in when your life could be manipulated by the authorities to that point? That's absolutely insane.
Yeah, I'd have to brush up on my civil claims and how you could get past the qualified immunity. I would think if if they're doing something that's outrageous or shocks the conscience or is outside of how they were trained to do it, going into like use of force kind of stuff, is it reasonable given their training? But I mean, the prospects, first of all, you have to prove the damages. After you get through the legal shield that they have, you got to prove your damages. And I don't know, maybe a malicious prosecution or something, just spitballing, but.
And so just one more question here. So like, let's say somebody, an officer bullies somebody into giving a confession, right, with false statements. Now, in court, can you like ask the officer or the detective what questions they asked to get the statement? And then would the officer either have to disclose or perjure himself on the false information given? And I don't know what kind of impacts that could have on the trial, but maybe, I don't know if that happens or anything. I'm just curious if that's something you can ask in a trial.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what those statements are, but my inclination is that this would probably be solved in a pretrial motion to suppress a confession, because those things exist. So usually you're fighting about what evidence will come into the trial before the trial even happens. And so, if something is egregious or if a confession is coerced, you can make a motion before trial and argue that motion, where I'm sure that the defense attorney and the prosecution will extensively play snippets from the interview. And if it's a big case, it will be, even if it's a small case, it'll probably be on camera or audio recorded.
Okay. All right. I'd just be interested to see what happens. Like if a cop like did have to like, so where'd you get this letter? Would they have to like disclose they fabricated it, or would they somehow be protected in whatever kind of cop legal mumbo jumbo, to just continue to lie to the court the same way they lied to the person accused?
Well, think about it this way, Kyle. I mean, usually you, as a defense attorney at the trial level, how would you even know that this letter was manufactured? I mean, it depends on a case by case basis, but how would you even know? Are you an attorney that's motivated enough to find out? Are you a public defender who's getting paid I guess you'd be salaried, but if you're a private, the rate is $70 an hour, which is 200% less than the private attorney charges per hour. So you're not getting paid much to do this.
Yeah.
And how would you figure that out unless, you were being diligent, very diligent, or if it just turns out that it wasn't true, you get a private test or something like that.
Yeah, you can maybe imagine the scenario where like the defense attorney happens to like, it's a small enough town that they know who the forensic analysts are, and so they don't recognize the name or the signature or something like that. Maybe you Google the name, but even then, I'm sure like most cities don't like have all their forensic analysts listed online or anything. So I don't know exactly how you would. That's a great question. I guess all right, so not to stay on this for too long, but would that be potentially exculpatory evidence if that was withheld from the defense, if they found out later that the confession was given on that ground? I mean, I guess in my mind, that would be obviously the case, right? Like if you found that out later, that would instantly be, we're throwing out the trial and doing a new trial because it's all based on this confession, which is obviously potentially fabricated. But so, just curious on that.
Yeah, well, it depends on what is the physical evidence of it, because, when I send a discovery demand to a prosecutor, I'm listing a bunch of things that I want, but there probably isn't any letter or anything that says, we lied and made up this thing. You just get the letter itself. Now, I'm thinking maybe you could subpoena the analyst who supposedly signed the letter.
Yeah.
And if you're doing your due diligence, maybe you do a Daubert hearing to challenge their credentials. And then maybe if you do the Daubert challenge, which is, when you challenge that someone is an expert and can testify as an expert, that's called the Daubert challenge. But you could do the Daubert challenge and bring this technician in front of the court and, whoops, there is no such person. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. That would all be really interesting. I guess so. Imagine like a scenario where, let's say like 5 years ago, you represented this guy, right? And then you found out today that the prosecutor had used a fake letter in a different case, could you then maybe look into it, and like if you found that it was a fake letter, that would probably be evidence that you could like bring forward to maybe get an appeal or a new trial or something?
Yeah, definitely. But a part of the standard is, and I'm reaching a little bit here, but generally you have to prove that it would have made a difference.
Yeah.
And in most cases, no, because once you're convicted, there's like if this is the slope and you get convicted at the top, then there's a backslide, and you have to like
Mm-hmm.
you're working against it. You're working against the tide,
Yeah.
and the standard all changes and the burden shifts.
Yep. There's several cases that are pretty popularly known, like the Adnan Syed. I think that's the Serial podcast and HBO documentary kid, where, there's obviously, if there was another trial, it's pretty coin flip which way it would go, right? And so you would think that would mean, okay, we'll do an appeal because new evidence has come forward that definitely like makes you ask some questions. But because a panel of judges has ruled, it's not likely in their interpretation enough to overturn the results of the trial, then they're not even going to have a trial. And so that's absurd, right? That's an absurd. You're no longer they're not even considering like reasonable doubt. They're just saying like, if it's unlikely now to be true, then no.
Right. And if you look through it in the legalese lens, it's like once there is a trial and you're convicted, all of the assumptions about presumption of innocence are gone. And it's not like once we find something, we're going to go back to that point in time, beforehand where you had that presumption of innocence.
Right. Yep, absolutely. Okay, Pat, I want to talk to you about this traffic cams thing, but I don't think it's as important as the other story. I just wanted to mention to people, there's this good article in ProPublica that goes on to the that all basically I think what happened is that Chicago put all the traffic cams in predominantly poor, and that means black and brown neighborhoods, and then now more black and brown people are getting tickets from the traffic cams, and they build these things as being race neutral and everything because it's a camera, not a cop, right? But it's just stealing a whole bunch of money from the poor residents of the city and all that, because they put the cameras in low income communities. But they note in here that the federal infrastructure bill that passed is going to allow cities and states to spend federal tax dollars on traffic cameras. So I'm guessing we're going to see a lot more traffic cameras coming up soon. And I could go on a whole like hour-long spiel about how terrible these things are and how they actually kill people. But no time for that, Pat, because we got to talk about the Justice Department creating a new domestic terrorism unit. And been talking about this for a long time. They're looking at a new domestic war on terror, and they're adding another piece to their network that they're putting together here, and this unit seems to be a part of it, Pat. Man, how scary is it to have another federal agency running around with the idea of likely entrapping people just like they do with the jihadist terrorism threat?
Yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, especially because one thing we were talking about, I might start doing work on some of these COVID cases. And one of the attorneys I've been talking about it with has been saying that she's afraid of this because, if parents who are going to PTA or school board meetings are labeled domestic terrorists, well, how are the attorneys who are challenging these COVID mandates in court going to be treated? And how are they going to look at us? And I think it's terrifying. And one thing I wonder with these units is, like, what kind of tactics are they going to use? Are they going to be tapping people's phones and trapping people? The other thing that I really worry about is, well, maybe on the good side, you mentioned all these agencies. Is this going to be like a 9/11 situation where like the CIA and the FBI are fighting with each other and things get through the cracks? Like, is this going to be another kind of like clan that has their own tribalist agendas, and maybe that will gum up the works? What do you think? Is that too optimistic?
I think so. My guess is that they're just going to like tap into the information provided by the other agencies, kind of like what we saw with the Operation Whistle Pig that the Customs and Border Patrol was carrying out, spying on American journalists under the name of vetting them. And so they were vetting them to hopefully use them to plant psyop informations about how bad forced labor was and everything like that, or that the U.S. had ability to crack down on forced labor that it didn't in Central America and all that. But in there, they just use like the FBI, NSA, and all that in their databases to enhance their abilities. And so I'm guessing that's what's going to happen here. But, you know, cops are terrible, so they do get in their own way at times too, and their incompetence is one of the few things that gives me hope.
What do you make about this whole thing that there is no specific federal domestic terrorism statute? I mean, I'm sure that's going to change very quickly, but what do you think about that?
I mean, I guess like in a sense there isn't one, but it's not like there isn't crimes that you would commit in the course of it. And so I feel like in a sense terrorism is maybe more of a cultural and social term than a legal term, right? So like if you're guilty of murdering people, uh, does it really matter? And like it could matter in sentencing, let's say, or something like that. But in like a strictly like charging sense, does it really matter, Pat, if somebody kills 9 people, if it's because they're a terrorist who believes in jihad and wants to like kill like the white Satan America, or if it's Dylan Roof who wants to kill a bunch of black people because he's a terrible bigot, or you know what I mean? Like I understand that like at sentencing it could matter and stuff like that, but does it really matter if he's charged with terrorism or not? If you're guilty of that kind of crime, your life is over. You know what I mean? Like you're not going to get out of jail. And so at best, and I'm not a fan of the death penalty anyway. So what would really be the point of having a specific terrorism charge other than just to have like a loose thing that like you can maybe stack, right? So then you could charge people with more different things so they feel like they have to plead guilty to lesser charges or something like that. I just don't understand what the end goal would be of it.
Well, I mean, I think you're making a mistake here, Kyle. You're making the assumption that these are good people who are just maybe a little misguided, but they really care about, the health and safety of the American people. And here the reality is that they're not good actors. I'm being facetious with you, but they're they're not good actors here. And I think that the whole part of this is that they they just want more control. They want more powers to pursue these ends. There's a political element to this with talking about, the establishment really loves this whole January 6th narrative. And I think that going forward, it's ushering in the new panoptic surveillance society, where they can just label anyone whatever they want. Domestic terrorism will fit you into this, and now you're going to be an enemy of the state. And moreover, before I forget about this, what I think that they're going to do, and we've seen this before, and maybe you can opine on this too, is that at January 6th, what they really started to do was recruit the help of the American people in catching these people. And there's this documentary on Netflix called Don't F with Cats. I don't know if you've seen that, but
I haven't, but I know the idea of it.
it's normalizing this whole snitch culture and recruiting people who will do the legwork of these intelligence agencies for them by analyzing social media posts and things like that. It's the snitch on your neighbor surveillance state from Nazi Germany or the Stasi or North Korea, or pick your totalitarian regime.
Yeah. And just to point out, there's a real risk to this because, not that so obviously I am a fan of citizen journalism, right? Like, doing your own online investigative research is important. However, you have to be important not to get caught up in a hysteria. And one of the dangerous things here is that the government is talking about having people target individuals, right? Like, I'm talking about like what the US government is doing and everything like that, right? I'm not saying that we should, go after, soldier Joe Schmo who lives down the block because of Yemen. That's in no way my messaging or anything like that. But they are targeting individuals. There's another Netflix documentary, I think it's called like Disappearance or Mystery at the Cecil Hotel. And in it, like at the very beginning, there's this girl doing weird things in the elevator, and she turns out to have fallen into the water tank. Complete waste of 4 hours. Don't watch the thing. Very obviously, that she was having a mental health crisis when I watched the first 30 seconds, and then they used some pretty slick editing to turn it into a 4 hour long documentary. But towards the end of it, what happened was the online community really started getting in and looking into her disappearance. And so they find this video of this creepy looking guy from Mexico. And and when I say creepy looking, he's one of your types like death metal, but low budget death metal type. And he makes this song about like being creepy in the hotel. And he posts it in just absolute coincidence 1 year to the day before the girl disappears. And so without any like I guess just like CNN level messing up, like just looking at the wrong dates and getting the numbers wrong, they pin it on this guy, and to the point where he actually attempts to kill himself. Like he attempts to commit suicide because everybody believes he did. Of course, the cops know that he was in Mexico on the day that she disappeared because he was signing a like legal document, like a record label contract, right? Like not the kind like a notary is there, right? He was definitely in Mexico on that day. The police don't come out with that. The guy doesn't play music anymore or anything because of what these people did to him, right? With their online mob mentality. And that's the same thing that could happen here. And it's very careful not to go after normal people for this kind of crazy stuff. And that is what the government is really trying to ramp people up to do. So fantastic point, Pat.
Yeah. And you and I, one of the first times that I was on when you were still doing Foreign Policy Focus, you and I did an episode about FBI entrapment schemes. And we really got into it on that. And I'm really proud of that episode. So I should find it and we should put it in the show notes page, because that goes over like a lot of the tactics. And I talk about in that a lot of the things that I wanted to talk about when you brought up, does it really matter what the motivations of these people are for committing these crimes? We really dissect that because, and you address that. You address this. I'm not critiquing you, but it does matter in the Western system of law. The particular case and the mens rea does matter, but your point stands exactly, is that, once you get to a certain point, what really is the motivation for these things on the enforcement end, I don't think really matters. It does matter for sentencing and culpability, but on the other end, it doesn't. We don't need a specific task force, a federal task force to evaluate certain types of crimes. I mean, is arson motivated by revenge in this case, or is it motivated by, insurance fraud? Right. We don't need two different task forces to take care of that problem.
Right. And I'm in no way trying to like diminish the crimes of people like Dylan Roof or Omar Mateen. I'm just saying that like when you're talking about court, that they killed all those people, right?
Right.
Like there's no question about it. They're definitely going to jail for absolute life. So does it really matter if they're, charged and convicted of a terrorism charge? Now, I think it's far more interesting, far more important for that to just be a separate cultural debate for people to have, like, how do we feel about these crimes in particular, and the people who committed them and their motives for them, and how do you stop those particular crimes? But, there's nothing that's going to be done within the courtroom to reform, to stop it, or to like really, I think like do anything to like heal or anything like that. That's, I think, much more likely going to be done like on a social and cultural level. One last point I want to make here, Pat, is just there's something really backwards. Oh, never mind. One more thing I want to say. because of that episode of that foreign policy focus show we did, immediately after the Gretchen Whitmer case broke, I called it. I said that there's a huge number of these guys that are FBI informants in this clearly an entrapment plot, and I've been 100% vindicated on that one. And
Yeah.
again, I like within 2 or 3 days of that instant, me and Will were on the show talking about, and I was absolutely saying that I think this is an entrapment plot. But the last point I want to make on the show today, Pat, is just that there's really something backwards here, right? Where, you have like this Black Lives Matter movement that's mainly, at least its motivation or what rallies people to the biggest, levels, is because the police are racist and abuse people, right? Like that's their main George Floyd, Michael Brown, things like that are what start Black Lives Matter protests and rallies to go on, right? But then at the same time, we're empowering the police more, right? But it's not. I mean, there are situations like Ahmaud Arbery where there are citizens who do, kill black men like they're cops and act like they're cops and things like that, right? But it's far more likely that like if you're going to have a situation where like it is clearly racial abuse and like a really disgusting thing going on, like this case in Ohio where a couple of cops pulled a paraplegic black man out of his car by his hair. He's sitting there crying to him like, hey, let somebody come, I'm a paraplegic, I can't get out of my car. And they keep yelling at him, get out of your car, we're gonna remove you from your car. And so they decide to do that by his hair. The police department decided that this, despite looking bad, wasn't that violent of a way to remove him from his car. And so, nobody's going to get fired or anything for that. Very unfortunate and disturbing. But I mean, honestly, if you really want to cut down on this kind of crime, Pat, I think you would really want to look into like the actions of police departments and police officers and not necessarily this domestic terrorism force directed at regular average citizens. You have an AP report from like a month ago about there's essentially just a network of white supremacists that operate within the Florida prison guard community. Why they're pretty open about their beliefs and they're just able to like work in these facilities still. Also, not to mention the disturbing thing about the U.S. trained neo-Nazis in Ukraine and that being the Florida National Guard. But talk about that a different day and just mention that like there's absolutely no looking at trying to examine the actions of the state and their enforcement methods for what they're doing to us and the problems that they're causing. And it's all being targeted back at the civilians. And that's just another example with this new domestic terrorism force. So any last thoughts, Pat? Anything I missed?
No, I mean, it's the meme FBI foils FBI terrorist plot. And I think you make a great point because a lot of this is, I mean, this is all motivated by government policy that, even the COVID, like if you think that people going to their school board meetings and getting pissed off and even getting extreme or violent, if you think that is terrorism, well, it's completely created by a government policy in the first place. So, yeah, but thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure, man.
Yeah, that's Patrick MacFarlane, Libertarian Institute, Liberty Weekly. Subscribe to the podcast somewhere and stay informed on what Pat's doing. Your show's been really cool lately because you got just so many. I like the Vietnam episode that you did. I forget the one I listened to before that, but you did another great one. Oh, and I don't know if you've been on since you did your episode with Scott Spalding on the Iraq War, but his talk about his deployment to Fallujah, I believe, is absolutely, like if you really want to like start to understand what these wars were like, those kind of perspectives and that kind of like slow breakdown what happened is so important. So thank you for doing what you're doing, Pat, and I hope everybody checks out your work, and we'll have to do another show soon.
Yeah, thanks, buddy.